No one outside the room hears the first scream clearly. It isn't loud enough to be understood. It isn't long enough to be recognized. The music keeps playing. People laugh. Someone refills a drink. Someone wins a game and celebrates. A house full of people continues living their lives while, just a few feet away, something irreversible is already happening. The bedroom door is locked. Inside, a marriage is collapsing in real time. A question is asked that cannot be unanswered. A truth is revealed that cannot be softened. And once it's spoken, there is no version of this night where everyone walks away alive. Outside, nobody intervenes, not because they don't care, but because they don't know. They think it's an argument. They think it's just words. They are wrong. Because when the door finally opens, the man who steps out is covered in blood, holding a knife, and speaks with no emotion at all. 5 words. That's all he says. And by the time anyone understands what those words mean, it's already over. What happened in that room took less than 30 minutes. What caused it took years. And the most disturbing part is this. Every single person involved believed they were doing the right thing, right up until the moment they weren't. The silence after the scream doesn't feel natural. It's thick, heavy, like the house itself is holding its breath. Outside, the music suddenly feels wrong. Too loud, too cheerful, and someone turns it down without knowing why. Conversations slow. People glance toward the hallway, then quickly look away, convincing themselves they're imagining things. Inside the locked bedroom, there is no yelling anymore. That's what makes it worse. The man stands still, staring at the woman he married 3 years earlier. His hands are shaking, but his face doesn't show anger. It shows something colder, something emptier. He asks her again what she meant. This time, she doesn't laugh. Alcohol has a way of stripping away defenses, and the truth comes out unevenly, not as a confession, not as a plan, but as fragments. Pieces of a story she never intended to tell all at once. She talks about before the marriage. She talks about mistakes. She talks about things that didn't matter anymore. But to him, every word lands like confirmation. Not discovery, confirmation. Because the fear he's lived with his entire life, the one he's never spoken out loud, now has a face. A name. A history. Outside the bedroom, a mother knocks gently at first. No answer. She knocks again, harder now, calling her daughter's name. Still nothing. The handle doesn't move. Someone else joins her. Then another. Inside, the conversation has stopped being a conversation. It's become an autopsy of a marriage. He asks why she married him. She hesitates. That hesitation matters more than the answer. When she finally speaks, the words are clumsy, honest in the way honesty becomes dangerous when it's late and fueled by alcohol. She talks about stability, about safety, about listening to advice. She doesn't say love, not the way he needs to hear it. The room feels smaller now. He sits on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he's replaying his entire life in reverse. Every childhood moment where he learned to stay quiet. Every time he believed that if he just worked harder, tried more, became more, it would be enough. Outside, guests whisper. Someone says this feels bad. Someone else says give them space. Nobody breaks the door. Inside, the questions turn sharper. He asks if she ever wanted him. She doesn't answer fast enough. He asks if she thinks about someone else when they're together. Silence again. And silence, in this moment, is louder than screaming. At the nightstand, his hand opens a drawer he's opened a dozen times before. A practical object. Something that was never meant for this. She sees it and understands immediately. Her voice rises now. Panic replaces confidence. She backs toward the door, hands out, trying to slow something that is already moving too fast. Outside, someone hears another sound. Furniture scraping, a thud, and freezes. They still don't break the door. Inside, the first strike doesn't end it. That's the part people don't want to imagine. Because it means there is time. Time to beg. Time to regret. Time to realize that whatever words were spoken earlier tonight were not worth this ending. Outside, someone finally runs. They pound on the door. They shout names. Phones come out. Someone calls 911 without knowing what to say yet. Inside, The room goes quiet again. When the door finally unlocks, the man who steps out is calm, detached, like the storm has already passed through him and moved on. He doesn't run. He doesn't explain. He tells them exactly what happened. Then he sits down and waits. And only then, only after the house fills with screaming, after people see the blood, after reality crashes in, does anyone realize the truth. This didn't start tonight. This night was just where everything ended. Midway check-in. If you're still watching right now, drop "I'm still here" in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Because what comes next isn't about violence. It's about how this moment was quietly engineered over years by fear, secrecy, and decisions no one thought would matter. The question doesn't come from police first. It comes from the people who were there. They replay the night in fragments, each person holding on to a different detail, a laugh that stopped too abruptly, a look that lingered too long, the way the air seemed to shift after a single sentence. No one can agree on the exact moment everything changed, only that it did. Neighbors gather outside as emergency lights paint the street in red and blue. Some of them recognize the house. Some remember waving to the couple before. None of them can reconcile the scene in front of them with the idea of a backyard cookout that had started just hours earlier. Inside, the man sits exactly where he said he would, his clothes stiff with drying blood, his posture upright, almost formal. When officers speak to him, he doesn't ramble or resist. He repeats the same sentence with a flatness that unsettles everyone in the room. He killed his wife. That part is not in dispute. What no one understands yet is how a celebration ended here. Detectives begin with the people outside the bedroom. They ask what was said, who heard it, who reacted. The answers overlap in ways that matter. Multiple witnesses describe the same moment. A joke that wasn't really a joke, a line that went too far, a comparison that should never have been made in public. They describe the husband's face changing, not erupting, changing, like something inside him went still. They also describe another reaction that stands out. A man who doesn't argue, doesn't defend himself, doesn't intervene. He leaves. No explanation, no goodbye, just a quiet exit that feels wrong in hindsight. That detail keeps surfacing. Why would someone leave a family gathering at the exact moment tension explodes? Police check timestamps. They verify departure times. They cross-reference phone data and security footage. The timeline narrows. The window becomes uncomfortably precise. He left while the argument was still unfolding, long before it became fatal. That doesn't make him responsible for what happened next. But it raises a different kind of question. What did he know? Detectives begin reconstructing the hours before the cookout. They learn it wasn't spontaneous chaos. It was carefully planned. Food ordered. Music curated. Guests invited intentionally. The woman had coordinated everything down to custom napkins. People remember how invested she seemed in making the day perfect. Too perfect. Several guests recall noticing her drinking earlier than usual. Not sloppy. Not out of control. Just early. And consistently. Wine first. Then something stronger. By the time the sun started setting, her energy had shifted. Restless. Overstimulated. Like she was bracing for something. Others mention her checking her phone repeatedly. At the time, it meant nothing. Afterward, it means everything. The husband, on the other hand, appeared relaxed. Proud. People congratulated him on a promotion. A raise. Stability. He smiled easily that day. He laughed more than usual. For a few hours, he looked like someone who believed his life was finally on track. That contrast matters. Because humiliation doesn't land the same on someone who feels secure. It cuts deeper when it confirms a fear that already exists. When detectives ask about the marriage, the answers are careful. No one describes screaming fights or visible abuse. Friends call them quiet, functional, predictable, the kind of couple people stop worrying about. But the language shifts when they talk longer. She seemed frustrated sometimes. He tried really hard. She complained about intimacy. He worked more than most. She wanted kids. They stopped talking about kids. Each sentence alone means nothing. Together, they form pressure. One friend hesitates before speaking. then says something that doesn't make it into any official report. She says it felt like the marriage worked because he was easy to manage. That word hangs in the air. Manage. Not love. Not partnership. Control without confrontation. Detectives turn to family next. That's when the story fractures. The brother who left early isn't just family. He's a pastor, a public figure, someone people sought for guidance, someone who spoke weekly about discipline, faith, and sacrifice. When police finally sit across from him, they don't accuse him of violence. They ask him about the relationship. He doesn't deny it. He admits there was something between them before the marriage. He admits it didn't fully end when it should have. He admits they kept in contact, long after lines should have been drawn. Phone records support him. Hundreds of messages over years. Most appear harmless. Some clearly are not. Some reference shared memories that should never have existed between siblings. Then there's the message sent minutes before the killing. He knows. I told him everything. I'm so sorry. The read receipt shows it was opened. There was time to respond. There was time to call. There was time to do something. Nothing happened. When detectives ask why, he says he believed the couple would argue and then calm down. That he didn't think it would turn violent. That he didn't want to escalate the situation. They don't interrupt. They don't argue. They let the silence do the work. Because this isn't about criminal responsibility. It's about moral collapse. Over the next 2 days, the investigation expands beyond the house. Media picks up the story. People dig into the pastor's past sermons. They dissect his words. They compare what he preached to what he lived. Congregation members feel betrayed. Some defend him. Some condemn him. Everyone is shocked. But the detectives are focused on something else. They're tracking patterns. And one pattern keeps repeating. When faced with discomfort, every person involved chose the same thing. Delay. Silence. Avoidance. The woman avoided confronting her dissatisfaction. The husband avoided confronting his fear. The brother avoided confronting the truth. The guests avoided confronting what felt wrong. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they created a situation no one could control. By the time police leave the house that night, the physical crime is over. But the psychological one is just beginning. Because the deeper question hasn't been answered yet. Not who did it, but how long everyone knew something was wrong and still believed it wasn't their place to interfere. That question doesn't fade. It follows the case forward. And it forces a closer look at how this marriage was built long before it collapsed. Quietly, carefully, and on foundations that were never stable to begin with. The early foundations of this story don't announce themselves as dangerous. They look ordinary, responsible, even admirable. From the outside, the man had built a life that checked every box people are taught to value. He worked hard. He stayed out of trouble. He didn't drink much. He didn't chase attention. He believed in discipline, in patience, in earning his place quietly rather than demanding it. That belief didn't come from nowhere. He grew up in a home where approval was conditional, where praise was rare and criticism was disguised as jokes, where silence was safer than speaking up and disappointment lingered longer than affection. He learned early that being noticed wasn't the same as being valued, and that the easiest way to survive was to make yourself small. So he did. He focused on what he could control. School, work, rules, numbers, systems where effort led to predictable outcomes. In those spaces, he excelled. People trusted him because he never caused problems. Supervisors promoted him because he never pushed back. Friends respected him because he never competed. But there was one area of his life where control never came easily. Intimacy. He carried a private shame that began long before adulthood. Something he never named out loud. Something reinforced quietly in locker rooms, in jokes overheard but never addressed, in comparisons that didn't need to be explicit to be devastating. By the time he reached adulthood, the belief was already cemented. He was fundamentally lacking. Not emotionally, not intellectually, physically. That belief shaped every relationship before it began. He didn't date. He didn't flirt. He avoided situations where discovery felt inevitable. Rejection, in his mind, wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty waiting to happen. So he built a different identity. reliable, safe, successful. If he couldn't be desired, he would be needed. That mindset followed him into adulthood and straight into his career. He worked longer hours than required. He volunteered for responsibilities no one else wanted. He built a reputation that didn't rely on charm or confidence, only consistency. It worked. By the time he met her, he was stable, established, quietly impressive. She entered his life during a period when hers was unraveling. Before him, there had been someone else. A relationship that lasted long enough to feel permanent, long enough to plan a future around, long enough to imagine children, a wedding, a life that followed the script she believed in. And then, without warning, it ended. Not gradually, not with conversations or closure. It ended with a message and silence. That kind of abandonment leaves a specific wound, one that makes people question their worth, replay every moment, search for meaning where none exists. She felt discarded, replaceable, forgotten. In the aftermath, she turned to the one person who felt safe. Her brother. He listened. He validated her pain. He stayed present when others offered platitudes. In that vulnerable space, boundaries blurred in ways neither of them had planned for, but neither stopped. What began as comfort turned into something else. Something secret. Something they both knew was wrong, which only made it feel more intense. It existed outside the rules that governed their public lives. For her, it filled the void left by abandonment. It reminded her she was wanted. For him, it represented escape. A life outside expectations. A private rebellion against the role he'd inherited rather than chosen. They didn't talk about it. They didn't define it. They let it exist in shadows where consequences felt distant. But shadows don't erase weight. When she met the man who would later become her husband, she knew the secret had to end. She wanted stability, marriage, children, a life that looked normal again. He offered that. He was kind, predictable, safe. Everything the previous relationship wasn't. Their connection grew slowly. He was careful, nervous, earnest. She found his attention flattering, his devotion reassuring. For the first time since being abandoned, she felt chosen again, even if desire wasn't the driving force. The physical reality of the relationship exposed a truth she wasn't prepared to confront. He noticed it immediately, the hesitation, the subtle shift in her body language, the way enthusiasm faded into obligation. She didn't criticize him. She didn't have to. His entire life had trained him to read disappointment in silence. He waited for rejection. It didn't come. Instead, she stayed. She told herself attraction wasn't everything. She listened to advice that framed stability as love and sacrifice as maturity. She believed that desire could be managed, that dissatisfaction could be ignored, that gratitude should outweigh longing. He believed he'd been accepted. Both of them were wrong, in different ways. They married believing they were making the responsible choice. The marriage didn't implode. It slowly hollowed out. She avoided intimacy. He compensated elsewhere. He worked more, earned more, provided more. He believed effort could substitute for incompatibility. She believed she could tolerate what she couldn't change. They didn't fight loudly. They didn't cheat openly. They didn't seek help. They functioned. And functioning can be more dangerous than failure, because it convinces people nothing is wrong. The secret connection never fully disappeared. Messages continued, not frequent enough to draw attention, not explicit enough to demand confrontation, just enough to keep the door open, enough to preserve comparison, enough to remind her of what was missing, enough to remind him of what he'd never chosen to give up. By the time the cookout was planned, the pressure had been building for years. Expectations, disappointments, secrets stacked carefully on top of one another, never addressed directly. Alcohol didn't create the truth that night. It removed the restraint. The joke wasn't accidental. It was reckless honesty fueled by years of resentment and longing. It was a moment where everything she had managed privately spilled into public view. For him, it wasn't just humiliation. It was confirmation. Confirmation that every fear he'd carried since adolescence had been justified. That his worth had always been conditional. That even marriage hadn't made him enough. And when people build their entire identity around proving they are sufficient, discovering they never were can be catastrophic. None of this excuses what happened next, but it explains why it didn't come from nowhere. Because by the time the bedroom door closed, the foundation was already cracked beyond repair. And once pressure reaches a certain point, something always gives. The only question is what? From the outside, this was the stretch of time people would later point to and say everything seemed fine. Not perfect, not passionate, but stable, predictable, safe. The marriage settled into routines that looked like progress. Mornings followed schedules. Evenings ended quietly. Bills were paid early. Vacations were planned months in advance. Photos from holidays showed smiles that didn't look forced unless you studied them too long. This is the phase where concern fades. Friends stopped checking in. Family stopped asking questions. Whatever doubts existed early on were replaced with the comfort of consistency. 3 years married. A house. A career moving upward. Those things signaled success, and people trusted signals more than subtleties. For him, this period felt like vindication. Work became the place where effort translated cleanly into results. He didn't have to guess how he was being evaluated. Expectations were clear. Performance could be measured. Promotions came not because he demanded them, but because he was reliable in a way others weren't. He arrived early, stayed late, took on projects that stressed other people out. When problems surfaced, he absorbed them quietly, believing that being useful was the same as being valued. And for a while it was. Each professional step forward reinforced the idea that his life was finally aligning, that he had found a formula that worked. Discipline, patience, endurance. He told himself these qualities mattered more than charisma or confidence ever could. At home, he tried to apply the same logic. When intimacy became strained, he didn't confront it. Confrontation had never brought him relief. Instead, he compensated. Gifts appeared unexpectedly. Trips were booked without discussion. He cooked more, cleaned more, asked less. He believed that if he removed enough friction, things would naturally improve. But relationships don't function like spreadsheets. She noticed the effort, but effort didn't address what was missing. It highlighted it. Each gesture reminded her of the imbalance she couldn't name without sounding ungrateful. She told herself this was what adulthood looked like. That desire faded. That security mattered more. That people who chased passion ended up disappointed. She repeated these ideas until they sounded like convictions. But resentment doesn't disappear when it's intellectualized. It waits. Intimacy became something she delayed rather than anticipated. She found reasons to be tired, stressed, distracted. He noticed every shift, the way her body stiffened, the way she avoided eye contact afterward, the way affection felt obligatory instead of mutual. He never accused her. Accusation risked rejection. Instead, he internalized the distance as evidence of personal failure. He added it to a mental list he'd been building since adolescence. Moments that confirmed he was lacking in ways that couldn't be fixed. Professionally, he was ascending. Personally, he was shrinking. The contrast was cruel. The more praise he received at work, the more invisible he felt at home. He didn't resent her openly. He resented himself for needing something he believed he didn't deserve to ask for. She, meanwhile, felt trapped by her own choices. The marriage wasn't abusive. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't dramatic enough to justify leaving. Everyone around her praised her stability. Her mother reminded her how fortunate she was. Friends envied the life she appeared to have built. So she stayed. But staying came at a cost. She compared silently, not just to past relationships, but to imagined ones, to versions of herself that felt more alive, to moments where she felt wanted rather than accommodated. The comparison she tried hardest to bury was the most dangerous one. The connection she told herself was over never fully disappeared. The messages weren't constant. They didn't need to be. They surfaced during moments of stress, after arguments, during periods of loneliness. Sometimes weeks would pass without contact, sometimes months, but the door never closed. For him, the brother, this phase was also an ascent. His public image strengthened. Attendance at the church increased. His sermons drew praise. People spoke about his discipline with admiration. They admired the way he had seemingly sacrificed a personal life for something greater. That admiration mattered to him more than he admitted. It validated years of compliance, years of living according to expectations that weren't originally his. The respect reinforced his authority and quieted doubts about the compromises he'd made. Privately, he lived with unresolved contradiction. He told himself the relationship was finished, that whatever had happened existed safely in the past, that as long as it didn't resurface physically, it no longer counted. But emotional intimacy has a longer half-life than physical contact. He liked knowing he still mattered to her, that she reached out when she felt overwhelmed, that she trusted him with thoughts she didn't share with her husband. It confirmed something dangerous, that he still had influence. As the couple began discussing children, pressure intensified. Attempts failed. Time passed. Conversations grew tense. Each disappointment carried more weight than the last. For her, it reinforced a narrative she didn't want to articulate. For him, it felt like another personal indictment. He asked himself questions he'd avoided his entire life. Was this his fault? Was this another way he was insufficient? Was he failing at the one role that mattered most? He never voiced those fears. Silence had always been his defense. She grew more irritable, less patient. The emotional distance widened. She didn't articulate dissatisfaction directly, but it surfaced in tone, in sarcasm, in moments where kindness was replaced by indifference. He absorbed it all. He believed endurance was strength. She believed endurance was maturity. Neither belief prevented damage. The marriage became functional rather than intimate. Conversations focused on logistics rather than connection. Plans replaced vulnerability. Days passed smoothly enough to avoid alarm, but without warmth. This is where danger hides. Not in chaos, in calm dissatisfaction. The cookout was meant to celebrate the version of life they presented to the world. His success, their stability, the idea that everything had worked out. Alcohol changed the equation. It didn't invent resentment. It removed restraint. Surrounded by family, buoyed by familiarity, she felt safe enough to let something slip that had been pressing against the surface for years. A thought she usually swallowed. A comparison she usually buried. When it came out, it wasn't strategic, but it was honest. For him, the ascent ended instantly. Not because of embarrassment alone, but because the statement collapsed the narrative he'd spent his life constructing. The belief that effort could compensate for inadequacy. That stability equaled acceptance. That love was something you earned by being useful. In one moment, all of it unraveled. What followed didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of proving himself, managing disappointment, and believing that silence was safer than truth. And once that belief shattered, there was nothing left to stabilize him. After the cookout, nothing immediately collapsed. That's what made it dangerous. There were no emergency conversations the next morning. No decisive ultimatums. No dramatic confessions that forced resolution. Instead, there was a quiet, uncomfortable return to routine, the kind that convinces people a crisis has passed when it has only been delayed. They woke up the next day in the same house, in the same bed, surrounded by the same life they had built. Sunlight filtered through the same windows. Phones buzzed with messages that pretended nothing had changed. The world kept moving, indifferent to what had been exposed. But pressure had shifted. Before, everything had been contained inside each of them. Private resentments, unspoken fears, silent comparisons. Now, the knowledge existed between them, occupying space neither of them knew how to navigate. He moved differently, not loudly, not aggressively, subtly. He spoke less, paused longer before responding. When she talked, he watched her instead of listening, studying tone, facial expressions, pauses. He replayed the moment over and over, not just what she said, but how easily it came out, how natural it sounded once the restraint was gone. That terrified him, because it meant the thought hadn't been fleeting. It had been rehearsed internally for years. She noticed the change immediately. His silence felt heavier than anger would have. Anger could be managed, explained, apologized away. Silence offered no structure. It left her guessing, filling the gaps with worst-case interpretations. She tried to soften things at first. Small gestures, forced affection, casual jokes meant to suggest the moment had been exaggerated by alcohol. He didn't respond. That unsettled her. She had always believed stability was something she could rely on, something he would preserve no matter how uncomfortable things became. His refusal to smooth things over signaled something new. Withdrawal. Pressure began arriving from outside the marriage as well. Family members noticed the shift. The cookout had been discussed quietly among relatives, dissected in hushed conversations that grew sharper as details spread. Everyone had an opinion. Few spoke directly to the couple. Her mother called more often, asked questions that sounded like concern but carried judgment underneath, suggested counseling, prayer, patience. Work became a refuge for him, but also a stressor. His promotion brought higher expectations, longer hours, less margin for error. The place where he once felt most in control now demanded more of him than ever, and control was slipping everywhere else. At night, sleep became difficult. He lay awake replaying conversations from years earlier, moments he had dismissed or minimized. He questioned memories he had trusted, reinterpreted silences he once found comforting. He asked himself things he had avoided for decades. Had he been chosen or settled for? Had he ever been desired or merely accepted? Had the marriage been real or practical? Those questions didn't arrive all at once. They arrived one by one, stacking pressure slowly. She felt it too, though differently. Guilt crept in where confidence once lived. Not just guilt for what she'd said, but for what it revealed about her own dissatisfaction. She couldn't unlearn the truth once it surfaced. She couldn't pretend it hadn't crossed her mind countless times before. She oscillated between defensiveness and fear. Some days she told herself he was overreacting. That couple survived worse. That words spoken under the influence shouldn't be treated as declarations. Other days, she feared he was finally seeing her clearly and might decide to leave. That possibility terrified her more than she admitted. Because despite her resentment, she relied on the life they had built, the stability, the identity, the future she had chosen deliberately after losing the one she thought she wanted. She reached out to the person who had always felt safe during moments of uncertainty. The messages resumed. Not dramatic, not explicit, carefully worded. Updates disguised as check-ins. Questions framed as concern. Emotional proximity disguised as familial support. He responded. He shouldn't have, but he did. The pressure wasn't only marital anymore. It was moral. He felt trapped between identities, the role he played publicly and the reality he carried privately. Every response he sent deepened the contradiction. Every ignored message would have felt like abandonment. So he chose the path he had always chosen. Avoidance. The husband sensed it. Not the messages themselves, but the shift they caused. The way her attention wandered. The way conversations stalled. The way she seemed emotionally elsewhere even when physically present. He didn't have proof. He didn't need it. His body reacted before his mind did. Tension accumulated. Appetite faded. Sleep fragmented. The quiet certainty that something was wrong solidified into something harder to contain. Pressure doesn't always explode outward. Sometimes it implodes. He began isolating emotionally, withdrawing even further, speaking in neutral tones, avoiding conflict while building internal narratives that grew darker with time. He told himself he was being rational, that he was protecting the marriage by not escalating, that patience would restore balance. But patience without communication becomes resentment. She tried to provoke reactions, minor criticisms, passive comments, anything to force a response that might reassure her he still cared enough to react. It worked, briefly, but the responses weren't what she expected. They were colder, shorter, measured. That scared her, because she had always believed his greatest weakness was compliance. Now compliance was gone. By the time the pressure reached its peak, neither of them recognized the relationship they were living inside. It had transformed into something fragile and volatile without ever becoming loud. That's the most dangerous kind of pressure. The kind that builds behind closed doors, reinforced by silence, fed by fear, and mistaken for stability until it's too late. No one outside the marriage saw it clearly. Not family, not friends, not coworkers. Everyone assumed things would settle. They didn't understand that the pressure had already surpassed the point where settling was possible. And when pressure reaches that point, it doesn't dissipate. It seeks release. The fracture didn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It revealed itself in hesitation, in the way conversations stalled halfway through sentences, in the way eye contact was avoided just long enough to register, in the growing sense that both of them were operating from different realities while sharing the same space. Trust doesn't usually collapse all at once. It thins, and once it thins enough, everything starts slipping through. He no longer believed what he was being told, not because he had evidence, but because belief itself had become exhausting. Every reassurance felt rehearsed. Every affectionate gesture felt strategic. He found himself scanning for inconsistencies, replaying interactions, searching for subtext where none had existed before. That kind of vigilance takes a toll. He stopped confiding in her entirely, not out of spite, but self-preservation. Vulnerability had become dangerous. Every insecurity felt like potential ammunition. Silence felt safer than honesty, even as it isolated him further. She felt the withdrawal acutely. The man who once tried so hard to please her was disappearing. In his place was someone distant, guarded, increasingly unreadable. She couldn't tell if he was preparing to leave or quietly punishing her for what she'd revealed. Both possibilities frightened her. She responded the only way she knew how, by trying to regain control. Not through confrontation, through positioning. She reframed events when they came up, minimizing what had happened, emphasizing context, reminding him that words spoken under the influence weren't truths. She positioned herself as misunderstood rather than accountable, believing that if she could shift the narrative, she could restore balance. It didn't work. Because the fracture wasn't about the words anymore. It was about certainty. He had crossed an internal threshold he didn't know existed, from doubt into belief. Once crossed, there was no going back. The insecurity he'd carried quietly for most of his life had finally attached itself to a specific person and a specific truth. That made it permanent. Paranoia doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like hyperfocus. He began noticing patterns. Her phone always face down. Messages deleted quickly. Excuses that sounded reasonable until they stacked on top of each other. None of it was conclusive. All of it felt significant. He didn't accuse her. Accusation would require engagement. Instead, he withdrew further, retreating inward where conclusions could form without challenge. She felt that shift and misread it. She assumed he would eventually move on, the way he always had. That time and routine would dull the discomfort. That his nature, compliant, accommodating, conflict-averse, would reassert itself. She underestimated how much had changed. For years, his identity had been built around endurance, around absorbing dissatisfaction quietly, around believing that worth was proven through tolerance. Now, endurance felt like self-betrayal. That realization hardened him. Outside the marriage, fractures widened as well. Family dynamics grew strained. Conversations became cautious. People sensed something was wrong but avoided specifics. Everyone was careful not to say the wrong thing, which only deepened the silence. Work, once a refuge, became another source of pressure. His focus slipped. Sleep deprivation caught up with him. Colleagues noticed he was more withdrawn, less patient. The composure that once defined him began to erode at the edges. She noticed that too. She worried that the version of him she relied on, the stable provider, the predictable partner, was disappearing. And if he disappeared, the life she'd chosen might collapse with him. Fear drove her back, toward familiarity, toward the one person who still made her feel understood without explanation. The messages continued. Sometimes they were mundane, sometimes emotional, always just close enough to matter. Each exchange reinforced a dynamic that should have ended years earlier. For him, responding became a reflex, not because he wanted to escalate, but because disengagement felt like another loss. He told himself he was offering support, that he wasn't doing anything wrong, but he knew the effect, and that knowledge mattered. The husband sensed the shift intensifying. His thoughts grew darker, less flexible. He began interpreting neutrality as hostility, silence as confirmation. The absence of reassurance became evidence rather than ambiguity. This is where trust fully breaks. Not when betrayal is proven. When uncertainty becomes intolerable. He stopped sleeping regularly. Nighttime became a loop of replayed memories, imagined scenarios, internal arguments that never reached resolution. His body remained tense even at rest, bracing for threats that never materialized but never disappeared either. She felt him slipping away and panicked. She tried to reassert closeness physically, emotionally, strategically. She alternated between apology and defensiveness, affection and irritation. The inconsistency only reinforced his belief that something was being managed rather than addressed. The fracture widened. Loyalty shifted from partnership to self-protection. Each of them began acting independently while pretending they were still aligned. That's when relationships become dangerous. Because communication stops being about truth. It becomes about survival. He no longer saw her as someone who could reassure him. She no longer saw him as someone she could predict. Every interaction felt like navigating unstable ground, unsure which step would cause collapse. The atmosphere inside the home changed. Not loudly, subtly. The tension became constant. Background noise, ever present. It followed them from room to room, settling into furniture, lingering in silence. Neither of them reached out for help. Not counseling, not family, not friends. Acknowledging the fracture would require naming it. Naming it would force decisions neither of them felt ready to make. So they waited. They believed waiting was safer. They were wrong. Because fractures don't heal without intervention. They widen. And once they widen far enough, everything built on top of them becomes unstable. By the time the next irreversible choice approached, the collapse was already underway. They just didn't recognize it yet. The moment didn't arrive with a warning. There was no single argument that marked the end. No explosive confession that forced clarity. What happened instead was quieter, more dangerous, because it felt like a decision made in the absence of options rather than the presence of choice. By this point, neither of them was reacting anymore. They were operating. Every word was measured. Every silence intentional. Every interaction filtered through an internal calculation of risk. What could be said? What couldn't? What would escalate? What might calm things down, even temporarily? He had stopped asking questions out loud. That didn't mean the questions were gone. They had turned inward, where they looped endlessly without challenge or correction. He replayed the past with new assumptions, reinterpreting moments he had once trusted. Gestures he once read as affection now felt strategic. Memories softened by love hardened into evidence. The realization that haunted him most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the belief that he had never truly been chosen. That he had been selected for safety, not desire. For stability, not intimacy. That the marriage had been a compromise she convinced herself she could live with. That belief altered everything. It reframed every sacrifice he'd made. Every hour worked late. Every accommodation. Every time he swallowed disappointment rather than naming it. What once felt like devotion now felt like exploitation. Not intentional, but real. And once someone reaches that conclusion, something fundamental shifts. The need to preserve the relationship is replaced by the need to preserve dignity. For her, the realization came differently. She sensed he was no longer invested in maintaining equilibrium. The version of him that absorbed discomfort quietly was gone. In its place was someone unpredictable, not violent, not loud, but emotionally unreachable. She couldn't tell whether he was preparing to leave or preparing to confront her. Both possibilities felt catastrophic. If he left, the life she had chosen, the one built deliberately after loss, would dissolve. The stability she relied on would vanish. The narrative she had defended would collapse under scrutiny. If he confronted her fully, she feared what she might say if pressed. Because the truth was no longer manageable. She had spent years believing she could compartmentalize dissatisfaction, that she could endure longing quietly, that maturity meant acceptance. But endurance had turned into resentment, and resentment had eroded empathy. She tried to regain control the only way she knew how, by minimizing, by reframing, by insisting that what had been revealed didn't define their marriage, that everyone made compromises, that no relationship was perfect. He listened without responding. That frightened her more than anger ever could. Silence suggested finality. The home no longer felt like shared territory. It felt divided, not spatially, but psychologically. Rooms became neutral zones rather than places of comfort. Conversations avoided anything meaningful. Even routine exchanges carried tension beneath them. The air felt charged. He began experiencing physical symptoms. Tightness in his chest, shallow breathing, a constant sense of agitation that never fully dissipated. His nervous system remained on high alert, scanning for threat even in moments of quiet. He told himself he was being rational, that he was finally seeing reality clearly, that what he felt was justified. Those beliefs didn't calm him. They hardened him. She oscillated between fear and defensiveness. Some moments she felt guilty. Other moments she felt angry. Angry that her dissatisfaction was being treated as betrayal. Angry that his insecurity had become her responsibility. That anger surfaced in ways she didn't fully control. Sharp comments. Comparisons left unfinished but implied. Moments of honesty delivered without cushioning. She didn't intend to be cruel. But cruelty doesn't require intention. It only requires timing. The final conversations before the point of no return were not dramatic. They were restrained, measured, and devastating in their restraint. He asked questions that weren't accusations, but demands for clarity. She answered carefully at first, then less so. The truth leaked out in fragments, not all at once, but enough to remove any remaining ambiguity. When he asked why she married him, her answer lacked malice but carried honesty stripped of empathy. She spoke about safety, about advice, about believing she could make it work. She didn't say love the way he needed to hear it, and that distinction mattered. He felt something inside him detach. Not explode, detach. This was the moment he stopped seeing himself as part of a shared future. From that point on, every thought revolved around one idea. He had been living a lie, not one she necessarily crafted intentionally, but one he had helped sustain by refusing to question it. The realization didn't make him angry. It made him feel erased. An erasure is a powerful trigger, because when someone believes their entire identity has been invalidated, that their sacrifices were meaningless, the instinct to reclaim agency can override judgment. This is where moral boundaries weaken, not because someone wants to harm, but because they feel they no longer exist in the narrative they built their life around. The last chance for intervention passed quietly. No one knocked on the door. No phone call interrupted the spiral. No outside voice entered the space. The people who might have intervened believed it wasn't their place. He believed he was finally seeing the truth. She believed the situation would still settle, the way it always had. Both beliefs were wrong. By the time the final decision formed in his mind, it didn't feel impulsive. It felt inevitable, a response to years of perceived humiliation, silence, and self-denial. A way to end a story he believed had been written without his consent. This wasn't a moment of rage. It was a moment of collapse. And once that collapse occurred, the line between thought and action narrowed rapidly. The point of no return is rarely dramatic when it arrives. It feels quiet, resolved, and by the time anyone recognizes it, there is nothing left to negotiate. What comes after the point of no return is not chaos. It's sequence. Events don't blur together the way people imagine. They line up, one after another, each action narrowing the range of outcomes until only one remains. Inside the house, control was already gone, even though nothing looked out of control yet. The argument didn't escalate the way arguments usually do. There was no shouting match that spiraled into violence. What unfolded instead was colder, more methodical, a conversation stripped of pretense, where restraint had finally failed. He stood while she spoke, not pacing, not gesturing, Still, that stillness unsettled her. She mistook it for restraint, for someone trying to hold himself together. She didn't realize it was the opposite, that something had already disengaged. She tried to explain. She framed her words carefully at first, emphasizing context, minimizing intention, insisting that what she had said didn't define how she felt. But explanations depend on shared reality, and theirs had already fractured beyond repair. When she sensed she was losing him, her tone shifted. Frustration surfaced where caution had been. Resentment slipped into honesty. Comparisons emerged that should never have been spoken aloud. Not because they were new, but because once spoken, they couldn't be contained. Every sentence removed another support beam. He listened without interrupting. That frightened her more than shouting would have. She moved toward him, trying to close the distance physically when emotional access was gone. He stepped away. That single movement confirmed what she had been trying not to see. She was losing control of the situation. Fear followed quickly. She tried to de-escalate, then justify, then defend, cycling through responses faster than he could register them. None of it mattered. The conversation had stopped being about understanding. It had become about survival. For him, something had simplified. Years of confusion condensed into a single, devastating certainty. He was not wanted. He had never been wanted. The life he believed he built had been tolerated, not chosen. That belief eclipsed everything else. He didn't see a future to protect anymore. That's when his hand moved. Not dramatically, not suddenly, deliberately. The object had been there for months. A precaution, something meant to make the house feel safer. He didn't grab it in anger. He grabbed it because, in that moment, it felt like the only remaining form of agency available to him. She saw it and froze. Her body reacted before her mind did. Backing away, hands raised, voice rising. She said his name. The sound broke through just enough to register, but not enough to stop him. The first strike didn't end it. That matters, because it means there was time. Time for her to understand what was happening. Time for panic to replace disbelief. Time for instinct to take over. She tried to protect herself, tried to create distance, tried to reach the door. Outside the room, life continued for a few seconds longer. Music still played. People still talked. Someone laughed at something unrelated. No one imagined what was unfolding just beyond the wall. Inside, the sequence continued. He didn't speak. That silence is what witnesses later struggled to understand most. No yelling, no insults, no declarations, just action. For her, the realization came too late. She wasn't arguing with her husband anymore. She was trying to survive. The sound that escaped the room was enough to register, but not enough to be understood. A scream swallowed by walls, by music, by disbelief. Outside, someone hesitated. They assumed it was an argument. They didn't break the door. Inside, the struggle ended unevenly. The human body is resilient, but only to a point. Defensive wounds formed where instinct took over. Each one evidence that she fought to stay alive. The room became quiet again. That quiet lasted longer than anyone outside would ever realize. When the door finally unlocked, the fall completed itself. He stepped into the hallway covered in blood, his movements controlled, his expression blank. The object hung loosely in his hand, no longer purposeful. He didn't look at the people gathered there. He didn't scan for exits. He spoke once. 5 words. They landed with finality. Then he sat down, waiting. The scene collapsed into noise after that, screaming, running, phones shaking in unsteady hands. Someone rushed into the room and understood immediately that nothing could be undone. The fall wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had believed this was a stable marriage. Everyone who had dismissed discomfort as normal. Everyone who had avoided intervention because it felt inappropriate. By the time emergency responders arrived, control had been lost for a long time. What remained was aftermath. And aftermath has a gravity all its own. After the sirens faded, the house didn't return to silence. It filled with a different kind of noise, radios crackling, boots moving across floors, voices lowered out of instinct rather than instruction. The aftermath of violence is never calm. It's procedural, methodical, almost impersonal in the way it reduces human lives to steps that must be followed. He didn't resist. When officers approached, weapons drawn, he complied immediately, hands behind his back, knees bending when told. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone following instructions rather than responding to a crisis. Blood still covered him. Someone asked if he understood what was happening. He nodded once. When they read his rights, he didn't interrupt. When they asked if he needed medical attention, he shook his head. The only request he made was quiet. He wanted to speak to her brother. That detail stayed with the officers. Inside the bedroom, paramedics already knew there was nothing to be done. The injuries told a story they had seen before. Not rage, not frenzy, but sustained intent. Defensive wounds marked the places where survival instincts had taken over. Time had passed. Enough time to hope. Enough time to realize hope wasn't working. She was pronounced dead shortly after. Outside, the people who had been celebrating hours earlier stood scattered across the yard and street. Some cried openly. Some stared. Some kept replaying the same moment aloud, asking if anyone else had noticed something earlier. The answers didn't help. Police began separating witnesses. Statements overlapped. Timelines aligned. Everyone described the same shift, the joke, the tension, the way one man left without explanation. That absence became louder after the fact. When detectives learned he had received a message minutes before the killing and opened it, the echo of that decision rippled outward. He hadn't caused the violence, but he had stepped away from the moment where intervention was still possible. That distinction mattered legally. It didn't matter emotionally. When he finally spoke to police days later, he didn't deny the relationship. He didn't minimize it. He described it as a failure of boundaries, a weakness he believed he had contained. He hadn't. When asked why he didn't respond to the message, he said he believed the couple would resolve things on their own, that he didn't want to interfere, that he didn't think she was in danger. The room stayed quiet after that answer, because hindsight makes certain beliefs unbearable. Public reaction followed quickly. The story spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city. It wasn't just about a murder anymore. It was about betrayal layered on betrayal. A pastor living a private life that contradicted his public one. A marriage built on compromise instead of honesty. A community forced to reckon with how easily appearances deceive. The church removed him from leadership within days. Some members defended him. Others felt humiliated by association. Attendance dropped. Counseling sessions filled. Trust fractured in places that had nothing to do with the crime itself. He left town shortly after. Changed his number. Withdrew from public life. In the only interview he would ever give, he said he would live with unanswered questions for the rest of his life. Whether he could have stopped it. Whether doing nothing was a choice. Whether silence was a form of harm. The man who committed the killing didn't speak much afterward. In court, he didn't dispute the facts. He didn't attempt to shift blame. He listened as the details were read aloud. Messages, timelines, medical findings. With the same stillness witnesses had described the night of the crime. When asked why he did it, he didn't offer philosophy. He said he felt erased. That word surfaced again and again. Erased. As if years of effort, restraint, and endurance had been invalidated in a single moment. As if the life he believed he was building had never truly existed. The sentence was severe. It ended the life he had built completely. Prison didn't bring clarity. It brought time. Time to replay moments that once felt insignificant. Time to understand that silence isn't neutral. That avoidance doesn't prevent harm. It often delays it until it becomes catastrophic. For those left behind, the echo lingered longer than the headlines. Family gatherings changed. Conversations stopped short. Certain jokes were never made again. Certain topics were avoided entirely. Everyone carried a private version of guilt, for what they missed, for what they dismissed, for what they assumed would resolve itself. No one walked away clean. That's the part true crime rarely resolves. There is no moral relief here. No single villain. No single mistake. No clean lesson that makes the outcome feel preventable in hindsight. Just a series of choices that felt reasonable in isolation. A series of silences mistaken for safety. and a final realization that arrives too late for everyone involved. Some truths don't destroy relationships when they're spoken. They destroy them when they're buried long enough to rot. And once they surface, the damage has already been done.